Consumer Bankers Association is pleased to welcome you to today's webinar, From Automation to Autonomy, How Agentic AI Turns Intelligence into Action, presented by Amdocs. My name is Isabella, and it's my pleasure to facilitate today's event. Thank you for joining. Please note we are recording and all participant lines are muted. If you have any trouble, please email conferences@consumerbankers.com or send a message in the Q&A box. This presentation will last up to 60 minutes and will include question and answer opportunities at the end. You may submit a question at any time by entering the questions into the Q&A box on the bottom of your screen. As a reminder, the views expressed in this webinar are those of the presenters and do not represent the views of CBA or its members. It is now my pleasure to introduce our speakers, Guy Hilton, VP of Strategy and GTM at Amdocs, and Paul Saleh, Principal Consultant at Amdocs. Guy and Paul, welcome.
Thank you very much,
Thanks,
Isabel.
Isabella. All right, so hello everyone. Thanks for joining us. So as Isabella introduced us, I'm Guy, this is Paul, and what we want to go over in the next probably hour or so is a bit of what we see in the market regarding the adoption of AI, Gen AI, Agentic AI, some things we talk to CIOs about, to CDOs, some best practices, and some things to think about as you continue your journey towards the AI and Agentic AI. So Paul, why don't you go ahead and first introduce yourself for a couple minutes?
Yeah, thank you, Guy. So, Paul Soleil, I'm Managing Principal Consultant over in the Amdocs studio. So, we focus on being able to work very closely with our customers and provide services and solutions inside of their environments. I've been working in technology for 20 years now across cloud, data, digital, and most recently generative AI, working across the FSI space as well as other markets as well.
And I'm Guy Hilton, no connection to Paris or to the hotel chain. I run strategy and go-to-market for Amdocs Studios and industry verticals with specific focus on financial services. Been doing it for also the better part of 20 odd years. Background in technology, moved at some point to the business development and strategy area, and this is where I've been doing my thing for probably the last 10 or 15 years.
Yeah, fantastic,
So
Guy.
thanks everyone for coming.
So, look, I think this is going to be a bit of a back and forth today. I have
Mhm.
some questions. I know you have some questions for me. So, let's go ahead and kick off. I'll throw out the first one. So,
Sure.
if
Shoot.
you had to summarize the Gen AI maturity curve today, where is the banking industry really?
Okay. Yeah, that's a very good question. And before I answer it, maybe we spend like 30 seconds in defining when we say Gen AI, what does it mean? Because it means a lot of different things to different people. So if you think about AI in general, there's like a maturity curve where in the old days we had RPA, robotic process automation, but these days we talk about Gen AI, which is more around probably I can generate content, code, or insights instantly from natural language prompts, and agentic AI, where I can understand business goals and I can autonomously manage workflows of business processes to achieve them. Then there's general artificial intelligence all the way to up to artificial super intelligence, where a lot of people are working at right now. In the current market, especially in banking, we're somewhere between Gen AI and agentic AI, meaning Gen AI in the form of chatbots that we see either in POC stages or some of them move to production, and agentic AI in the sense of automating workflows through an agentic force. Now, where is the banking industry? I think that when you look at statistics, the majority are still in the POC stage. So different analyst firms are covering this, but probably more than 60% today are investing in Gen AI and agentic AI. The majority, so probably 50 out of those 60, are probably still in the POC stage. 8 to 9% are moving types of use cases to production.
Yep, I absolutely agree with those stats. And look, I think it's a great way to put the scale or the maturity curve from Gen AI back towards robotic process automation and then towards super intelligence. That's definitely where the industry is looking to go. I don't know when and where they'll get it and what it'll look like when we get there, but that's definitely an exciting thing. Coming back to banking, though, so from what you're seeing in the market, what are the high value use cases that are gaining traction in consumer banking? So across customer experience, risk, ops, compliance.
Okay. I'll just probably say that what we see again is mostly still in different the different stages of POC stages with different levels of maturity, but it's more around content generation, content management, some synthetic data generation, knowledge search, and so on. Specific ones, if I think I'll try to sort of maybe build those into specific categories or sub-segments. So there's a lot around customer engagement and enablement. I think one of the key things everyone's talking about is personalized banking offers. We'll talk about probably, I guess, more in the next couple of minutes. Things like financial health tools, things like loan portfolio management. There's a lot around operational efficiency or operations automation, anything from exception handling, payment data analytics, financial contract management, and so on, all the way into the risk management and also compliance reporting, things like fraud detection, things like suitability complaint, liquidity and cash forecasting, risk model training, and so on. So there really is a very wide net of different use cases. It really depends on where the business challenges of that specific company, bank, and so on are actually at, or where do they feel they want to start. I think there's a majority currently towards back end type of use cases versus front end, but literally it's they're testing it all.
And it's wonderful. I definitely see the same things in the customers that I'm working with, where a lot of the technology is focused on the back end, like you say, where we're doing enablement only because it's less risky than putting a agentic workforce in front of customers directly today. So,
Yeah,
and that risk
and
comes,
I
and
agree.
I'm sure we'll talk about it during this webinar. The risk comes a lot from lack of governance or immature governance frameworks, and the data not quite being where it needs to be.
Yeah, and so maybe a follow-up question for you actually on that one, because I
Hmm?
know you're seeing a lot of our customers, especially on the US side, and there's like a perception that most Gen AI initiatives are still sort of trapped in POC stage. So I know I see it, globally, but do you think it's also true when you talk to our customers? And if you do you have any like data points or ratios that you're actually seeing across the industry?
Yeah, absolutely. So look, that's POC purgatory. It's a very real thing inside of banking, but not for the reasons that most people think. So across the programs that we support, we see about 60 to 70% of initiatives stuck in the POC or pilot stage. Now, it's partially because things are stuck or because they're moving so quickly that there's a lot in pilot that they haven't had the regulatory mandate to move up the stack a bit. About 20 to 30% is in limited production or in one business line. We're finding that areas like capital markets tend to move a bit faster than the enterprise banking. Again, points back to a lot of regulatory controls, also points to
Mhm.
just the nature of their business. And then 5 to 10% are truly scaled across the enterprise. So very few use cases have actually been fully adopted across all areas inside of banks. But the bottleneck isn't model performance, it's data readiness, governance, integration with real workflows. Most banks can get a chatbot or summarizer live in weeks, but what they struggle with is operationalizing the reliability securely and repeatedly across the bank. So
Okay.
what's changing now is that leadership teams are asking, what is the ROI? So they're looking for things that are generating actual revenue, actual return for the work that they're doing. I mentioned that a bit of the work that we're doing is in enablement, and it's in enablement because we're shifting from legacy systems into modern systems on the back end to support this generative AI push within their business. But at the same time, we're using generative AI and we're using agentic specifically to help support the refactoring of these legacy systems because it could be 20, 30, 40-year-old systems that the developers that originally built it are long gone from the business and there's no real documentation that follows. So traditionally, taking time to analyze those systems, build a plan for them, start migrating the code and refactoring into something modern would take years to accomplish. These days, it's taking months, not years.
All right. You mentioned ROI, so I want to maybe just expand on that a bit, maybe zoom out,
Mhm.
and instead of ROI, maybe I'll call it value. So, what's like the biggest misconception that you see today, either from banks or from vendors, doesn't matter, about where the Gen AI value truly lies?
So the biggest
I know it's
misconception I
I know
see,
it's a very big question.
It's a big one. It's a big one, but I like it. The biggest misconception that I've seen is that the value is from better answers or friendlier chatbots. So the idea of hallucination comes up over and over and over, where when you're using chatbots directly, hallucination's an issue, right? If
Yeah.
you have 95% accuracy of a model, 5% of the time it is making stuff up just to satisfy you. And that's where hallucination comes from. Um, but it's not where the real value lies. The real value in generative AI and agentic, even moving to AGI and ASI, it's from the operational leverage. So what can Gen AI do in an organization? The idea of hallucination, just coming back to that quickly, can be diminished with the way you architect these systems, the way you put them together, the controls that you put in place, even having um, what we tend to implement a lot is agents validating agents. So you're not getting the first shot response from a question that you ask. You're actually getting the ninth shot response from the question because we've put it into an iterative loop to validate itself. And that might be using the same model for both agents. It might be using different models for both agents because each of them has a different capacity, a different ability. But we're putting those checks and balances in place. Very much like if you bring on a brand new college graduate to do an analyst job and they're working through an analysis, you're not going to take that analysis and put it in front of a customer. You're going to have multiple checks and balances before the output of a college graduate ever gets in front of a customer because you're going to want to teach the college graduate or that brand new intern how to do the work. But you also want to make sure that what he's doing, you're leveraging, improving, and validating and putting in front of the customer. So we're taking the same approach to the way we're implementing these agentic systems or agentic pods. Um, so
I love the
banks and
fact that
vendors.
you're comparing agentic to college graduates. I think that's an amazing analogy. Sorry, go
It it's it's accurate. It's accurate. We're finding that it's
on.
very accurate because day one, these agents, they have the ability to reason, very much like you come out of college with a degree, and really all it tells employers is you're able to think. Like you have the capacity to think. That's pretty much
Yeah.
what a college degree does today. Um, but they have no context of the business. They have no context of the industry. They have no context of anything. They can just reason. They can just think. If you give them a problem, they'll give you a solution. Whether it's right, whether it's fit for your company, all that still needs to be taught into them. And it's the same thing with agents, right?
All right. Let's speak a bit about agents. So we talked a bit about trends and what's happening in the market. I want to maybe start deep diving into the topic of why we're all here today. And let's talk a bit about, when you try to think about implementations of agentic AI.
Mm-hmm.
So when a bank decides to move from Gen AI chatbots to agentic AI system, what fundamentally changes? I mean, what are like the non-negotiables that we need to think about?
So first and foremost, it's the mental model changes. You
Okay.
know, I mentioned earlier about how we have to switch from thinking about friendlier chatbots that have better single shot responses to actually trying to figure out where the value is and changing the operational leverage and implementing it into real workflows in the business. Well, that is the first thing that needs to change. So that mental model, you're no longer designing prompts. You're no longer looking for the best explanation of something when you're designing a system, when you're like implementing this stuff. You're now looking at LLMs not as a tool, but as an orchestrator of tools, as an orchestrator of workflows. So what you're doing is instead of designing a single prompt to get the best answer, you're designing a whole system. So policies, routing, logic, memory, verification, escalation paths. Escalation is a very important thing in these systems because when hallucination does come up or when there's a problem that your virtual college grad can't answer, they need to be able to escalate it and bring in an expert in the loop to give them the right answer and guide them in the right way. So the requirements are really shifting from accuracy of a response to reliability and governance. So some of the things that we're implementing for guardrails, or just in general in our systems actually, are deterministic guardrails. So we know what good looks like. Let's put the guardrails in place. Let's have a validation bot checking the responses so that we can get to the right outcome. It might take 3 iterations, it might take 6 iterations, but we will get there in a time faster than typically a human would be able to generate the same outcome. Transparent reasoning chains. I mentioned trust and governance earlier. I've talked way too much about the history of ML lately, but the first 5 years that ML was out and it was providing outcomes, it was providing predictions, people didn't trust it because it was a black box. So no one actually scaled ML for the first 5 years until they realized that the ML was providing a better prediction than the systems they currently had. So we can easily fall into the same trap now with agentic and with agents. But what we're doing to go around that is having the transparent reasoning chains, being able to enumerate why the agents are making the decisions they're making. So it does 2 things for us. One, it allows us to follow the logic and see if the logic is sound. If the logic isn't sound, then we can always tell them where the logic fell over, tell them to remember how we fix the logic so that they can get the answer right in the future. So it comes with clear audit logs, being able to see all that, having identity and proper permissioning, and then fallback logic when the confidence drops. So what we typically implement with ours is a confidence threshold. So depending on what they are executing on, let's say it's a low risk activity, let's say it's a code refactor, as an example. We will set an 80% threshold, which means that if the agent is 80% confident based on its cycle, that the deterministic plan that it has created, excuse me, is going to work, it will execute it autonomously. If it's 79%, it will escalate it. And that way,
Okay.
we have confidence and we know that the agent has confidence in the actions that it's taking. And if it doesn't have that confidence, again, it's escalating to a person. And then I think the last thing is what really becomes the hard part is integration. We have between 20 to 50 existing upstream and downstream systems between CRM, case management, core banking, know your customer, claims, loan servicing. And these are systems that in today's day and age are very heavily controlled. So coming back to that trust, coming back to that governance, coming back to the observability and the safety that we have to have around the agents, all that needs to be in place to even integrate into these systems. And without that integration, we're not going to see true value, true end-to-end value from having these agents working in environments.
I agree. And maybe I would add one more thing. The more agents you have, you need to start probably also thinking about access control and who gets, who gets entry to what type of information and so on, as you would in any other enterprise scenario, even today without
Mhm.
agentic.
No, absolutely agree. Um, it's interesting. That challenge is one that we've faced into quite heavily. So traditionally, when we were talking about agents, and I can't even say years ago, 3 to 4 months ago, we were talking a lot about RAG-based systems, right? And RAG-based systems are great. They give the data to the agent to be able to do its job, bring in all of this information so that it can quickly respond. The problem with RAG-based systems tends to be that we are softer with our security controls around this huge RAG database than we are around the source system data. And it creates a huge attack plane for bad actors.
Yep.
So what we've actually been shifting to with a lot of our systems, we still have RAG, and we have RAG for data that is non-sensitive, but also not fast-moving. But for anything that is fast-moving data, because you don't want to have live stream into your RAG vector database, anything that's sensitive, because you don't want to be pulling finance data, trade data, HR data into this RAG database, because then just becomes, a definite attack surface for people. We've gone to multi-agent RAG. So keep some of that RAG data in there that makes sense to keep there. But then for the areas like HR, like finance, like trade detail, actually develop an agent that sits in front that is your guard, your access control agent, that that agent has access to the sensitive system, but then is summarizing at a level that makes sense for the request and the user behind the request. So that way you're controlling that access and you're controlling that data flow and you're auditing that data flow as well. Um, yeah, just adding that extra level of security between the user and that sensitive data so that organizations can, one, pass regulation, but also be confident that what the agents are working with is what they should be working with.
Yeah, makes sense. Okay.
So look, on the topic of data, um, what are the true like data and cloud table stakes for agentic AI? And which of those are hygiene versus which are true differentiators for organizations today?
Okay. That's actually a very good question. Let's start with hygiene. That's probably easy. One of the probably the key questions that a lot of CIOs and CDOs are dealing with today is our data estate ready for prime time? Prime time being agentic AI in our case, right? And the answer is that the data estate today, and I don't think it comes to a surprise to any of us, is fairly fragmented. There's machine learning tools. There's a bunch of generative AI beginning of starts and so on. There's BI tools there. There's streaming applications. There's data warehouses, data lakes. In fact, one of the CDOs probably 2 weeks ago said, I have several data lakes. In fact, some of them have actually dried up. Now they're data swamps. And all this needs to be in a certain level of quality and confidence before you apply an agentic sort of flavor to it. Because, in the data world, we used to say garbage in, garbage out. But honestly, in the agentic space, it's garbage in 1,000 times garbage out. And it's a sort of a nightmare scenario for CDOs to have an agentic implementation act upon bad data. So hygiene is key. Now we can look, do we need hygiene and a clear quality of data for a specific use case? Do we need it across the entire estate if we want to go full scale enterprise and so on? These are discussions that are happening literally in rooms as we speak. But I think it goes beyond that, right? Because if you think about what needs to be in place in order for an agentic implementation to be successful, then there's data itself and the hygiene and the quality of it. But we need to think about other things. I think you touched upon a few in your previous answer, but things like you want to have processes and tools that can manage the AI agent teams, whether it's security tools, data tools, and so on. You want to have some sort of a management platform. You want to be able to fine tune the AI teams and roles as you actually go for, and that's all done through data. The key thing that I think at least we've been talking to our customers about is the governance and the AI lineage. Because as you said before, these are sort of college grads, they're gonna make mistakes. The question is, what's gonna happen when that mistake is there? How can you roll back quickly, trace where the mistake was, and retrain the model? If needs be, retrain it again and again. I think that when you look at this and maybe have even agent-driven governance that has human oversight, that's a key thing that is a differentiator between a good implementation and one that would probably be challenged down the road. And the last thing is what type of data, once you have it, is accessible to the AI teams? Is it like a data lake and lakehouse model for structured, unstructured data? Is it a comprehensive data model and in a tool catalog that you can leverage? So it goes beyond is my data, at a certain quality or not? Also, what's the surrounding element? And I'll throw another one at you because when we talk about data, we seem to sometimes forget what data resides on. And that's actually cloud. Now, cloud supposedly is not an issue anymore, right? Because essentially everyone's on cloud, microservices, they've modernized the applications and so on. But I would argue that when you look at the cloud platform maturity, is there a developer environment? Do you have your cost and FinOps and observability figured out? Is there like integration and delivery figured out, centralized monitoring, logging? You want to have that cloud space with like unified control plane, um, maybe a global policy engine and stuff like that. You want to have those in place as the data resides upon them. And I think these two like are the bundle that then makes the agentic implementation what it is or what it should be and gets you that level. Because if you have that right, then you can have then on top of it a data and ML layer, and on top of it the agentic framework itself. And then you have this trio of layers working in unison. I think this is where the actual competitive advantage is. It gets you the speed,
Hmm.
the accuracy, the quality, and the ability to fine tune and roll back quickly if and when you need it.
Yeah, fantastic. And look, I completely agree with you. Cloud is fundamental to to getting all of this right, to getting data right, to having all that automation around it. What I find interesting and enlightening, especially around FSI, and it's not just honestly segmented to FSI, it's across most industries today. There is a shift towards on-premise, and it's not on-premise as it used to be. It's on-premise in a highly automated way. So trying to get what they used to call private cloud, which used to just be a legacy on-premise,
Yeah.
into the future state, which is a highly automated state to almost match the public cloud providers, right?
Yeah.
And I agree with you. Things like global policies around security and governance, but that means having that policy stretch across public cloud, but also your own private cloud and your own automation. Because,
Correct.
like in FSI, one of the interesting caveats is the security frameworks tend to be more focused on premise or private cloud can touch your public cloud, but not the other way around. The other way around is always an exception. So
Yeah.
there is definitely like that need in the cloud space to have that highly automated, rigorous path to production, but also having the right things in place, having like parallel data between production and non-production just sanitized, being able to use agentic to build those data sets in non-production to match the production volumes, types, and variability, so that you can do proper testing with confidence go to production. So
All right.
yeah,
Cool. So,
absolutely interesting.
look, we're like 30 minutes into our discussion. Um,
Yes.
let's put some examples in there, okay? Because I think we're
Okay.
we're probably sharing a lot of theories and what we see in the market, but you've been dealing with probably most of the cutting edge type of projects that
Mm,
we do in that space. Can you maybe share or walk us through, I don't know, a recent example where like we had, I don't know, agent-based automation that materially changed the outcome. So it wasn't just a nice to have, it really made sort of a dent in the way we work today.
absolutely. Um, there's a few different use cases that I could run through, but I think the one that I want to today is vulnerability management. So
Okay.
vulnerability management is one of those things that's been foundational for ITSM for a long time. But what we find is that large enterprises tend to deal with the really critical stuff, but everything else gets put on the backlog and moved through. So one of our clients today has around 2.5 million vulnerabilities across their entire estate.
Wow.
They're working
Okay.
with they're working with governance organizations to work through it. They have a moderated plan to work through it. They have regular checkpoints. But obviously, all this adds overhead, adds risk. They have millions of vulnerabilities, and they're continuing to push some of these and progress some of these. Some will be replaced as they upgrade applications, but new vulnerabilities will be added. So we've recently gone through a piece of work with them just to identify what the ROI looks like to work with them. And one of the eye-opening things was if you assume that you could take 300 fractional employees, so FTE, so full-time equivalents, right? It might be spread over 1,000 developers, might be spread over 3,000 developers. Those 300 FTE would take something like 17 years to actually resolve the amount of vulnerabilities they have in the environment, which doesn't make sense, right?
Correct.
So
Totally.
what we did was we worked with them on a model where we can scale up the agentic pods to focus on vulnerabilities and not even go, yes, we could take 100% vulnerabilities because that's not accurate, right? So we assume that we could start at 30% of the low-hanging fruit, the things that are defined, the things that are known, looking at infrastructure, looking at middleware, and ultimately scale up as we continuously train the agents, as we refine the agents, as they get to know the environment better, because we've implemented a shared memory for those agents to write back into so they continuously learn off of the work that they're doing, the vulnerabilities are closing, whether it's been successful, whether it hasn't been successful. So we have a model where it scales from 30% benefit up to 70% benefit, still with a workforce that is scaling back. And what we found is by year 6, we could actually close every single vulnerability that they have while scaling that FTE workforce down from 300 equivalent to 60 equivalent. So
Wow. Okay.
significantly dropping the amount of human capital that needs to be invested in just closing vulnerabilities, but also resolving their entire backlog and going into a maintenance mode rather than a put out fire mode. So that materially impacts the way that they're working with their regulators. It materially impacts the amount of effort that they're putting towards this initiative because today you're basically moving 300 FTE to deal with vulnerabilities. Tomorrow, what they'll be able to do is take those, pardon me, my math is slow this morning, 240 freed up FTE and focus them on high value outcomes, focus them on
Right.
development efforts, focus them on future product enhancements rather than closing security gaps
So productivity goes up in a big way, essentially.
massively.
Yeah.
I mean, you're
So that
essentially freeing
definitely
up
is a good
240
example
developers.
of a material of a material change. Yeah, or a material outcome.
It's definitely a material outcome, and that's really just from the productivity point of view. But having the regulators come off and go, yeah, we're comfortable. You no longer have to report to us. You no longer have that overhead. Like, you don't have that overhead. You
That's
don't have
huge.
the fines from the regulators that you're continuously paying because you're not technically in compliance, right? So there's a
Makes
few
total
different
sense.
buckets that that ROI comes from, which is awesome. Which is awesome. It's great to see that scale of change just by implementing this one use case. Like it's just vulnerability management. And then there's opportunities obviously to scale that across. So look at before vulnerabilities even occur, how to use agentic to validate code, how to use agentic to red team the environment to identify vulnerabilities that they don't even know about and close potential security gaps that
Yeah.
bad actors could take advantage of. Right. So there's multiple areas that we'll be scaling into, just taking that ROI from this one area, which is an enormous ROI, and being able to shift some of that value into developing more use cases and developing in areas that materially shift the opportunities that the bank has.
Yep.
So, look, one of the things that we run into, and I'll be completely frank with this, is governance. Like, governance is difficult.
Yes.
Governance often lags innovation. However, governance with agentic AI is a key topic across more organizations today. So,
Yeah.
what role do you see governance playing in agentic, and how can organizations catch their governance up with their innovation?
Look, governance and innovation in the same sentence is always a challenge. Okay, let's be honest. I would say though that especially in agentic AI, when you're really pushing the envelope of the organization, if you have innovation and you don't have governance, think of it like innovation without governance would spell chaos, right?
Mhm.
So usually governance in at least every innovation project I've been part of comes at the end as a bolt-on, right? So you run the whole innovation thing internally, everybody gets excited, and before it goes public or a couple of months before, you start introducing to the compliance teams, governance teams, and so on, and then you get some feedback. You have to go back, change a few things, close a few loops, and so on. It won't work like that with agentic, right? With agentic, I think that what we want to look at is you need to bake governance from the get-go. It has to be a place where essentially you think about governance, not as a bolt-on, but something that is already there from the get-go. You want to define the ownership. So, for example, who approves the data sources, the prompts, the models, the actions, all right? What's like your model risk management, right? So do you have an inventory, versioning, validation cadences, clear accountability in these types of elements? This is crucial. Do you look at ethics and transparency, which is also a big part of governance, especially when you talk about agentic force, because there's a bias there. There's an inherent bias in an LLM that you need to teach again and again. So is it traceable? Is it explainable? Users basically should know, why a decision was made and then act upon it. So specifically in the case of agentic AI, I try to think of governance as like the best analogy I can give is governance is like the oxygen that lets innovation breathe safely, and then you can
Mm.
really do a lot of stuff. And it has to be there from the beginning. Otherwise, you're gonna get yourself into a whole world of challenges as you're about to launch a new agentic experience.
No, thank you for that. I completely agree with you. Like governance, if you do it right, almost protects these initiatives and lets them grow. Like it is that oxygen, it is that food for them. It's funny though what you said at the beginning about initiatives getting to the point where they're almost in production and then go into a governance board and security board. I feel like I've been through that fight so many times where do you remember Monty Python, the Holy Grail, the Black Knight, where he just
Yes.
kept getting the limbs cut off? Is like this is just a flesh wound. Um, I felt like that early in my career. Then I was just like, this is just a flesh wound. Now I know a lot better, and definitely security governance needs to come in day one and be foundational to anything that we're delivering. Um, so look, besides governance, where do you see banks typically getting stuck when trying to scale agentic beyond the POCs? Like what
Oh
organizational
wow.
blockers matter more than the technical blockers, and what best
Okay.
practices have you seen to
That
overcome them?
that is an excellent question. I'd start by saying that we're all very focused on the technology. So how are
Mm,
we training the models and what we're going to do and what the agent is going to look like and what does A2A look like and what are the access controls and security. We kept talking to them for the last, I don't know, 40 minutes or so just in our discussion. But if you try to think what makes a good implementation really scale across the enterprise, there are a few more items there. So one is data. We talked about that. The other one is governance and everything that has to do with that. And the third one, I think, is people. And I don't think we spend enough time thinking about the human factor. And I'll give you a couple of examples, right? Think of it this way. If you look at technology adoption and you don't have human adaptation, it's gonna fail. So if you really want to make this a success, you need to think about things like upskilling, right? You want to upskill your people on I don't know, prompt design, agentic orchestration, evaluation frameworks. You have to build those fusion teams where you have on one end the technical resources, right? The data scientists and so on. But you want to bring in the domain experts and the compliance teams and the operations, and you really co-create those use cases. And then you want to probably have AI champions. And I think that's a very good best practice I saw in several of the leading banks across the globe, that they have AI champions inside the business units who connect the innovation with the real workflows. Because as we said, ROI, and you want to actually come up with a use case that means something that creates that material impact. These are the key things that you have there. And the best Gen AI systems or agentic systems aren't really smart. They're also being trusted by the people that shape them because there's a high level of confidence in how you actually develop and deploy them. And there are two other items there still in the sort of human realm. One is what you don't measure, you can't really scale, especially with everything that has to do with agentic AI. There's always the question of, so what did it do? How well did it work? Especially by the executives. Where's the business case? Where's the ROI?
hmm
So you want to actually define those success metrics early, whether it's productivity, whether it's experience and engagement, whether it's risk and compliance, whether it's, now we're starting to see, and I'm happy to talk about it maybe at another time, but agentic specific KPIs, things that are relevant not just for in the class of things that you think about NPS or AHT or stuff like that, but really agentic KPIs for the agentic era. And then you want to make sure the executives see the Gen AI impact in the same dashboards that show them, I don't know, revenues and risk and so on. The last thing here, probably, and this is the best tip I think I got from one of the CIOs in Asia Pacific. I just came back from a 2-week roadshow there. He said, dude, you don't go from zero to autonomous overnight. And that's something it's not a flick of a switch. There's a whole sort of, we use the word journey a lot, right? You start with assist, so think like um, read-only chatbots for knowledge retrieval. Then you move into orchestrate, which is kind of what we're talking about right now, which is agentic workflows, workflow automations, and so on. And then you move to bounded autonomy, which is like policy anchored agents with guardrails that run specific tasks. And each time you want to pass between one of those phases, it's not just a technology gate. It has to be some sort of a combo or combination between a technical, an ethical, human, and operational. And only when
hmm
these align then you really get that progress. It's when trust and maturity actually align together is where you get that clear indication that you can really move to the next stage.
Absolutely. And look, there's two common approaches. Most of the organizations I'm working with are either focused on use case led approach or a framework led. So, do we get ROI day one and then figure out how to build what's behind it? Or do we build everything, you build your gilded castle and then start building use cases on it? How should a bank decide which path is right and when do the approaches break down?
Um, I don't think one is right or wrong. I think they're both super valid. It really depends what you're aiming at, right? The use case approach, I think it's good for testing the water, show the capabilities, get a quick win with the business teams without boiling the ocean. So if you think about the amount of effort required to, get a use case up and running from a data and cloud perspective and governance, everything we just talked about is significantly lower than going on a full-blown framework implementation that then builds upon it or so on. Having said that, if you think about framework approach, then you're looking at something that actually scales, right? It creates consistency. It's easily redeployed. It's really if you think about it, a foundation across many use cases, and that's super important as you want to go into a full-blown enterprise deployment. Now, if you want to do just use cases, and I think this is where most of the POCs are today, they're looking at either a use case or several use cases under one category and they're running with
Hmm.
those, which is great, by the way. I think that's good because it creates a learning curve. But as you do these and then you do another use case and another use case, and there's no commonality or framework that actually helps you, create that consistency, what you're actually doing is you're creating the silos of tomorrow. Because in a couple of months, years, depends on how quickly you want to progress with this, you want these use cases to start connecting to one another. You want these specific agents that were purpose built to start talking to one another. And then you have to break some of those silos in order to do it, which is again the classic game of let's build something, then break the silo because we need now consistency. If you're looking at agentic framework from the get-go, I think it creates that foundation. And if you agree on the basics, which is your master prompt contract and the way the foundation is and the customizations and how you actually create that agent to agent interaction, regardless of what the agent does, by the way, right? And you apply the governance and everything else we just talked about. On top
Hmm.
of these, you can run practically any use case, and it's pretty much guaranteed that they'll all work in unison if and when you're going to need them to. Now, there's another interesting thing that if you zoom out even more, because we're super focused on how do we do this in our organization, front office, back office, operational efficiency use case, revenue generating use case, doesn't matter. It's all within, our own capabilities as an organization. But what's going to happen pretty soon, if you think about it, is think about something called collaborative autonomy. That's a term I use a lot. So as you zoom out from your own specific bank, you're going to be doing things with other banks. Think like post-trade exception management. It's probably the one of the classic operational efficiency use cases that we see out there in the market. You need to
Hmm.
talk to a counterparty who's in a different bank or a different counterpart. You might be talking to a fintech. You're talking to your customers. There's always a regulator somewhere in that ecosystem. So essentially, what you're creating would be beyond what you're doing in your own organization. You have agents talking to someone else's agents, talking to the regulator agents or whatever. It's a whole new ecosystem. If you're
Yep.
going with the framework approach, it's going to be easy for you to actually be flexible and move that around. If you're going at the end of the day, long-term strategy, use case by use case, you're going to be somewhat more rigid. And that might be a big challenge if you want to work and be a meaningful player in this now ever evolving ecosystem.
Yeah, I love that guy. Um, a lot of the conversations I've had recently with customers has been, and I repeat this word for word, use the tactical to build the strategic. Like
Yes,
pick those
I
initial
love
use
that.
cases to get ROI, to get funding back, and then leverage that funding to go build a strategic framework. Because where the value that I've seen really comes from is start getting this to your front line. The technologists in the back office, the managers, they know 20% of the problems that are actually being faced by the front line. The other
Yep.
80% of use cases live on that front line. And if we're not putting it in the hands of the actual operators, of the frontline employees, then we're losing a lot of that value that could be had. But in order to do that in a way that it's not just a POC, it's not just an unregulated pilot, we need to have that framework and we need to have that path to production, even for the frontline use cases. So I love that.
All right, so I'll connect that with probably my question for you. And again,
Uh,
I'm looking for best practices. So I'm a bank, right? I want to be production ready with I had that specific comment made to me by one of our customers. I want to be production ready with agentic AI within 12 months. What are the and here's where I'll add my question. What are the I don't know, 4 or 5 things that are a must-have you need in place in order to meet, such a timeline?
just throw that one out at me, guy. Um, but the first thing is something that you touched on earlier, which is a unified data layer with explicit contracts.
Okay.
So you don't have to have perfect data. That's my view. A little bit of hallucination, a little ghost in the shell isn't going to break these more advanced agentic workflows. But you do need to have accessible data, governed data, catalog data. You need to have lineage, PII classifications. You need to have multi-agent systems in front of it to make sure that the access controls are being respected. And you have to have business semantics aligned to target use cases. So when you start having that, then you can finally say, yes, I have a unified data layer that's supporting my agentic workflow, right? Once that's there, because that's foundational, you then have to build an agent safe architecture. So have isolated execution layers, role-based access, deterministic guardrails, model observability, and those policies for escalation to bring humans and experts into the loop. So having observability is a big thing in my view because of the trust that it builds. We talked about security and governance earlier, and the idea that governance is that air that allows for this innovation to grow. And it's 100% true. Without that governance, without observability, without the right architecture to give that, then trust starts eroding in these agents. And then once trust erodes, usage drops, right? Trust needs to be there for adoption. So without the right agent safe architecture, you won't have adoption, you won't have trust. Regulators won't allow it in some areas where you'll lose huge benefits that would potentially be there. um, I think the next aspect, so once you have your unified data layer, you have your agent architecture that you can scale on, then it's about ownership. So bring that people back into the loop. It's not just about the technology. You need to have business, technology, and risk and compliance all at the table, having the conversation together. So business needs to define the outcomes. What are we looking for? What are we looking to automate? What flows in our business are incredibly manual, but low criticality and low expertise manual. Like, where can we add this automation that isn't RPA, that isn't fragile like RPA has been, but is robust and can do these jobs and actually think about what the right outcome is? That's what business's role is, to really define those things that are going to push the needle. Tech needs to build the system. Tech ultimately needs to own the architecture, own the automation, build what needs to be built in order for this to remain safe, because that's where tech has played for a very long time. And then risk and compliance needs to set those operating boundaries. I talked a little bit about the confidence thresholds. Those weren't set arbitrarily. Those were set in compliance or in conjunction with the business and with risk. And risk set the absolute minimum thresholds. Business went, yeah, no, we can't trust it yet. So let's lower that threshold a little bit. Um, and ultimately, they'll raise it as the models prove themselves, as the agents prove themselves, as automation continues to happen. They'll loosen the grip a little bit to raise that threshold so they don't have to be inserted as often as they are today. So most failed programs skip that alignment. They skip that alignment between the business and the tech and the risk and compliance. They either approach it from a tech side, ignoring risk and compliance and business, or business decides to go out with a credit card and go, yep, I'm going to buy this system. I'm going to build my use cases on it, which is that dark IT or that shadow IT that's been happening for years, anyways. So now we have alignment. Um, the next thing is the repeatable factory model. So as I said, most of the value you get comes from these things being in the frontline employees' hands. So the ability to automate their own processes, to automate what those flows are. Um, that factory model needs to be in place so it's repeatable, so it's governed, so that you can quickly get from idea to pilot to production with these ideas and start gaining real value from them. My recommendation for every customer I talk to is figure out 3 to 5 high volume use cases. You might have trade exceptions, know your customer, claims, collections, lending documentation, whatever it may be. Focus on those at first. Work with compliance, work with the business, focus on mapping all that out, automating them, recognize the ROI from them while you build the strategic layers underneath. Because the strategic layers underneath are going to be what you need to scale everything. But at first, you can only do so much with what you have until people are ready, until your framework is ready, and then you can open the floodgates. I have a customer that recently opened the floodgates just for one of their divisions, and within I think 3 weeks had 1,800 new use cases built on their agentic framework. Now, not all of
Wow.
those are in production yet. They're still going through like pilot and POC and validating and tuning, but that is what it looks like when you open to the front line, that you have a lot of these use cases immediately pop up that you can then work through and identify the ROI and drive from the front line so that tech can focus on the repeatability, the framework, the governance, the security, the controls, while letting the frontline business do what it needs to do to automate away a lot of its more tedious work.
Yep, I agree, and I would add also, business sponsorship is huge. At the end of the day,
Yes.
we're not doing this as a technology exercise. We're doing this to improve either operational efficiency, productivity, and bottom line that way, or create new revenue streams the other way. So whichever it is, there's always going to be a business involvement significant to look at. And the earlier we get them excited, the earlier we have, this meeting of the minds on what really are we looking to work with. I think that would go a long way in making
Mm,
that implementation also very successful in the period of, let's say, 12 months.
yeah, absolutely. Um,
I'm just
companies
looking
I work
at,
with, no, I was going to say companies I work with all the time, executive sponsorship is incredibly important. If it's not coming from the top down, then groups like risk and compliance are going, no, but we haven't had a mandate to actually do this, so we're just going to put the brakes on everything. And then the business goes, we don't have time to deal with giving us back more time because we have our day-to-day tasks, right? So
correct.
I agree, like it needs to be from the top down mandated, but then it needs to be from the bottom up adopted.
I like that. I really like that. I think that's a great summary. I'm just looking quickly at our sort of Q&A. Guys, if you have any questions, now would be a good time to ask them. We
Mhm.
probably have like 5 minutes till the end of the panel. So if there are any questions you want to ask or things that you think we've missed out on, happy to get those comments and questions in. All right. In the
Yeah,
meantime,
I'll,
until we get those questions, I'll
well,
just
can
want
I
to say, yeah, go
Sorry,
ahead.
can I expand on one of the ones that was answered and you quickly messaged back? So another
Sure.
agentic AI will be implemented for the governance. Thank you for submitting that. This is something I'm actually really passionate about, the idea of having supervisory agents that sit across the entire stack. So when you actually scale this framework, you want to put agents that are looking at everything holistically. So the idea of having domain agents is one thing, but having those ones for governance, for security, for FinOps, looking at these agents, looking at the flows, looking at everything that's happening, and making sure that it is the most effective use of token count and coming back and giving recommendations and giving tuning suggestions and iterating on the agents as you move forward so that the same response or the similar response next time only costs half as much because you've tuned the way that it's looking for requests. You've tuned the actual token counts as part of that. But same for governance. Governance, all the agent-agent interactions, we need to have a governance supervisor that is looking at those interactions and ensuring compliance across them, ensuring that when you are going cross-domain, even what Guy mentioned earlier, when you're going cross-organization, did we hold our governance and regulatory compliance controls while we went cross-domain or while we went cross-organization? Because those controls are very, very important for organizations to recognize.
Yeah.
So thank you for that question.
Yep. So Paul, I think we're almost at the top of the hour, so I just want to take a moment to thank you for answering those questions I threw at you. I want to thank Isabella and Abel for hosting us. And if there are any additional questions, we'll take them offline. We're happy to reply to those. If there's a way to get back to you guys, we'll happily send you our feedback, our thoughts on your questions.
Absolutely.
Thank you guys so much. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Guy, for joining us. And thank you to all of our attendees who logged on this morning. And with that, we will conclude today's program. The recording will be available in 1 to 2 business days. And on behalf of CBA, thank you again to our speakers and everyone who joined today. Have a great afternoon, and you may now disconnect. Thanks,
Thank
guys.
you.
Thank you, everyone, for giving us this opportunity.